Good evening. If you want to open to Mark chapter 5, that is where we'll be spending our time tonight. Mark chapter 5. And actually, if you want to open to chapter 1, verse 1 of Mark, we'll start by reading from there. So the book of Mark, if you've never read it, if you're not all that familiar with it, it's a pretty direct and uncomplicated gospel. And the word gospel means good news. So the author, John Mark, is presenting the good news about Jesus. And we'll read his thesis statement in just a moment. But it's pretty direct. It's pretty uncomplicated. I think of Mark almost like the gospel of the 7-year-old. So if you've ever been told a story by a 7-year-old who's very excited to tell you this story, then you probably have experienced something like they're telling you this story, and then this happened, and immediately this happened, and right away, and they're so excited, they can't catch a breath, they just want to get the story out, right? That's kind of what Mark does in his gospel. If you read through it, he over and over again, he says immediately, and while he was doing this, and just then, he says things like that constantly. He's so excited to get out this story about Jesus. Now, at the same time, he is also carefully designed his gospel. From the very first line, if you're there in Mark chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Now, this is interesting here because here he calls Jesus the Son of God, right? But this is the only time in his gospel that he tells you what he thinks about Jesus. For the rest of the gospel, what he does is he lays out stories about Jesus, and he tells you what other people thought of him. And his goal is to influence you to think that Jesus is, in fact, the Son of God. Now, the content of Mark's gospel begins with a summary of Jesus' core message. And this is verses 14 and 15 of Mark 1. It says that Jesus came into Galilee proclaiming the gospel of God and saying, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the gospel." So God is restoring his reign over the world by confronting and defeating evil through Jesus. That's the good news. The kingdom is here. And after this introduction to Jesus' message, Mark places several blocks of stories that are meant to illustrate what it looks like when the kingdom arrives in a place. And if you read through the gospel, it looks like people are being healed. People are being taught about the gospel of Jesus. Demons are being cast out. The dead are being raised up. That's what happens when God's kingdom arrives at a place. And our text for tonight is an example of that, an example of what happens when the kingdom arrives into town. And in fact, it's actually two examples. Because in this gospel, where we meet just this overflowing enthusiasm, we also meet real literary sophistication, okay? And in Mark chapter 5, what Mark does is something that he does over and over again in the gospel. I think of it at least as a story sandwich, okay? He makes a story sandwich here in Mark chapter 5. Because what he does is he starts one story, and then he gets so excited, it's almost like he remembers another story. And so he wants to tell you that story. And then he tells you that story, and then he comes back around and he finishes the first story, okay? So he has first story, second story, and then completes the first story. He makes a story sandwich. He does that here in Mark chapter 5. And these two stories, I think, I talk about them as though it was less than intentional, but I think it's very intentional that they're placed together in this way because they spark off of each other. As the stories come together, the sparks fly that help illuminate both stories. And they're both stories about fear and faith, and about how Jesus can move us from a place of fear into a place of faith. So, tonight, we're going to start with the story in the middle, but remember that these stories are sparking off of each other, and so we're going to catch up with the first story in just a moment. But pick up reading with me in verse 25 of Mark chapter 5. It says that there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but actually grew worse. Now, if you read Leviticus, if you go back to the Old Testament and read in Leviticus, you'll find that this issue that this woman had meant that she was unclean. ceremonially unclean. Now that meant that anything that she touched, anything she sat on, any person she came into contact with was also unclean. Now, she's been suffering physically for 12 years, right? That's what we're told. But it's almost like the psychological suffering that she's enduring is almost worse, because she's the person that if she's walking down the street, everyone is avoiding. Just don't even go close to her. She's unclean. If you touch her, you're unclean. So she's outcast from society. And also, as if that weren't more than enough, to be unclean meant that she couldn't attend the synagogue service. And we talked about that some this morning in Dennis's lesson, that the center of these Jewish communities, the place of worship, the place where they could come together as a community to rebind, to worship their God together, she's excluded from these assemblies. She can't attend. And so at every level of her life, at the physical level, at the psychological, emotional level, at the spiritual level, this woman is suffering and has been suffering for over a decade. So she hears about this healer. She hears about Jesus. And she hatches this plan of desperation. And in verse 27, it says that she came up behind Jesus in the crowd and she touched his garment. For she said, if I could touch even his garment, I will be made well. Now this desperate move, this idea that I'm not even going to talk to him, because that would make him unclean. I don't want to go too far. I'm just going to try to get close enough just to touch the very edge of his garment, right? That I'm just going to just brush against the cloth that he's wearing. And that is somehow going to change my life. And so she summons enormous courage, because even that move, even something as relatively small as that, as she's walking in the crowd, people know, you're not supposed to be here. This isn't where you belong. And now she's going to touch the teacher. She summons enormous courage and follows through with her plan. In verse 29, immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, and we'll pause there, we'll pick up reading there later, but I've always been fascinated with that phrase, maybe you have too, the idea that Jesus perceived that power had gone out from him. There are lots of different explanations as to what exactly that means, but whatever it means, the point is that Jesus is the source of healing power that this woman has accessed just by brushing up against his garment, that this power explodes into her life to heal this woman at every level, physical and social and spiritual, that she's healed. In verse 33, the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Father, or daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." This word faith, this is the center of our thoughts for tonight. The word, the idea of faith. It's famous for being a little unclear. Now, if I were to ask you exactly how to define faith, your mind might go to Hebrews 11 and verse 1. But the complicated thing about this word is that it can mean different things in different contexts. It can be translated as trust or allegiance or faith or belief and a variety of other things. But here in this context, I think at its most basic meaning, Jesus is telling her that your trust in me has healed you. Your trust in me has physically healed you. It's enabled power to come out from me to save you. Now for us, you and me in this auditorium, you may be an upstanding member of society, you may be respectable, you may be put together, or you may not be. But either way, we all have something. Maybe for you, it is physical. Maybe you have something in your life, your physical bodily life, that you just can't get rid of, and you've been suffering with it for years. Maybe for you it's social. Maybe you just have never really felt like you belong anywhere. Maybe for you it's spiritual. Maybe prayer just doesn't feel like it used to. Maybe the worship service just feels like you're checking a box, and if nothing else, it just feels long. Maybe the songs just aren't coming from your heart. Whatever it is, we all have something. And inside of us, we all carry this guilt, this shame, this fear. And so we find ourselves like this woman. And I don't know, maybe you've been suffering with whatever your thing is for 12 years, maybe even longer. But we find ourselves like this woman, reaching out to Jesus. Now, hold her in your mind, and let's pick up with a man who's on his knees. This is verse 22. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue. In other words, this is an important man, Jairus by name. And seeing Jesus, he falls at his feet and implores him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." This word translated "made well." It's the same word translated as to be healed with the woman. It's the word that means saved. That she would be saved and live. Now, you and I, Jesus, when we hear the name Jesus, there are certain things that come to mind, right? We know Jesus as God in a human body, the incarnate Son of God. That's Jesus. But Jairus doesn't know Jesus like that. Jairus, this man, he knows Jesus by reputation. He's heard that he has a knack for stirring up different towns that he goes to with his teachings. He's heard rumors that he is a healer. And so he comes to Jesus. And the fact that this important man, this synagogue official, comes and kneels at the feet of this carpenter from out of town, someone who societally is far below him, but he kneels at his feet. It shows us how desperate he is, because he's a father, and he says that his little daughter is at the point of death. And literally, this says that she has it terminally. She has it terminally. So this is the situation that he's in. And gently, humbly, respectfully, I want us, as best we can, to put ourselves in Jairus' shoes. So this is a father who knows that his daughter is dying, and he's willing to do anything, right? He's willing to try whatever it takes, even to throw away what's proper, to throw away what's fitting of a man of his stature, and just to beg for Jesus to come and help. And the thing is, that we've all been there in life. If you've lived very long on this earth, you've been there, where someone that you love is in great danger, whatever type of danger it is. And you want God, you want someone to help, right? For us, we want God to come and help. So if you're in that situation with Jairus, how thrilling are the next words here in verse 24, that Jesus went with Jairus. So maybe there is a glimmer of hope after all, right? Like, here comes the healer. He's going to come and I hope heal my daughter. And this is where the story in the middle breaks in. The PB&J on the PB&J sandwich. This is where the peanut butter and jelly break in. The story in the middle. And it's amazing, right? You have the courage of the woman. You have the power of Jesus. You have healing at every level. And we, as readers, are caught up in the moment, because it's a beautiful, powerful moment. But I want us to keep our eyes fixed on Jairus. Because as all of this is going on, for Jairus, maybe he's leaning on one foot, and it keeps going, and so he switches, and then it keeps going, so he switches back again. And the whole time he's thinking, remember why we're here, Jesus? Like we were in the middle of something, and it's not like he's hard-hearted, but this woman's been sick for a long time. My daughter is dying right now. It's time to go, right? Like, if you're Jairus, this is what you're thinking. And verse 30, Jesus is apparently not in a hurry, because it says, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately he turned about in the crowd, and he said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing about you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. So it's this whole scene. And finally, the woman comes forward, and she tells her whole story of tragedy and suffering and healing, and it's beautiful. We get caught up in it. But remember, keep your eyes fixed on Jairus, because as all of this is happening, he has to be about to lose it, right? As all of this is happening, even the disciples are like, "Jesus, why are you asking who touched you? We're in a crowd, that people are bumping into each other constantly." And remember, we're doing something here, right? Like, we're in the middle of something that's going on. And I think this also is a moment that we can all identify with. Because I don't know about you, But I think a lot of us have wondered at some point in life what God is doing, where he is, and why he hasn't done what we've asked him to do. Like Jairus here, why aren't you coming? Why are you focused on this thing that is much less urgent than my thing? My thing feels so right? It feels good. It's what's supposed to happen, and yet it's not happening. Verse 35, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead." Now, you can imagine how this must have felt, right? Is in this moment, Jairus' heart just shatters. But then, verse 36, Jesus overhears what they said, and he says to Jairus, "Do not fear, only believe." Do not fear, only believe. Now, this is the verb form of the same word translated faith earlier on. Don't be afraid, just have faith. Don't be afraid, only believe. Now, that might sound good in here, right? In this auditorium, where we are all people of faith, and we come here because of our faith. It sounds good to read in this place. But in real life, they arrive at the house, and it says that Jesus saw a commotion and people weeping and wailing loudly. So it's Jairus' worst nightmare, right? His fears are confirmed. His daughter has passed away. And so that thought, don't be afraid, only believe, meets this real-life moment where he has to have these thoughts of what if he hadn't dawdled with that other woman, right? What if he had just come like I asked him to come? What is he doing? And if he had done that, my daughter has still been alive. And grief is many things. It expresses itself in many ways, but at its core, grief is anger, right? And so here Jairus has to have felt like this was a slap in the face. And then, to make matters worse, verse 39, when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but is sleeping." Now again, we know the story. We know who Jesus is. If Jesus tells us something, we're going to believe it. But Jairus doesn't necessarily know that at this point. And so he has to have thought, are you just mocking me now? Is this just a game to you? And so his deep sadness is now accompanied by rage. And again, I think a lot of us have been there. Or we have this deep sadness about life. And maybe we discover that actually that sadness is not just sadness, but there's also anger mixed in there. Exasperation and confusion and frustration about why life is the way that it is. I don't know about you, but if you've read the Psalms, people sometimes take that out on God. They say, "Why aren't you doing what you promised you would do?" That's their human experience, right? God doesn't fail in his promises. But in their human experience, they feel let down. So they cry out to God. Maybe you've been there. Maybe Jairus is there right now. But then, at this moment, there's a beautiful point in this story. Verse 40, Jesus took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Now, this a side note, a separate bedroom here, a separate room. This was a sign of how well off they were. So this is a family that is wealthy, but in a moment like this, you couldn't care less about that, right? It's one of those moments that humbles us all to the same level. And Jesus, taking her by the hand, says to her, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Now, the New Testament was originally written in Greek, in ancient Greek. But Jesus spoke Aramaic. That was the language that he spoke on a regular basis. So what we have in our New Testaments, when we read the words of Jesus, have been translated by the gospel writers from Aramaic, a different language, into Greek, and then obviously translated for us from Greek into English. So that happens with 99.9999999% of all the words in the New Testament. But there are 3 times where the gospel writers preserve the original Aramaic words of Jesus. And this is one of those times. Talitha kumi. Talitha kumi. Now, scholars tell us that this means more than just little girl, which is how it's translated in a lot of Bibles, which, as in mine, which means little girl, I say to you, arise. Now, they tell us this means a little bit more than that. It's that it's like what a parent might say to wake up a child who is sleeping. Something like, honey, get up. It's an endearing and intimate term, a term of endearment that he uses in this moment. Talitha kumi. Honey, it's time to get up. That's the image. And immediately, verse 42, the girl got up, and she began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. Now, don't miss that detail. She was 12 years of age. If you remember, the time frame of 12 years has also been mentioned another time in this context, because for the last 12 years, this little girl has been growing, and that woman has been suffering, right? And this girl comes from a place of relative privilege and prosperity, and the woman comes from a place of physical and social and spiritual isolation. And the woman is suffering from this disease that makes her unclean. The girl is unclean by virtue of her death. That was the main way that people became unclean in the Jewish culture. But on this day, 12 years in, Jesus heals them both, right? He comes in his own time, in his own way, Jesus heals them. In his own time, in his own way. Now, I don't like that. I want control over the time and the way in which my healing takes place. But faith, in many ways, is the act of two twin impulses, the act of reaching out and letting go. Of reaching out and letting go. And that's what both of these stories here illustrate, that this father comes to Jesus, he reaches out to Jesus, but then he realizes this is done on Jesus' own time and in his own way. He has to let go. And this woman, same thing, where she comes to Jesus, she's healed, she reaches out, but then she realizes she also has to let go. She can't just be healed on her own timetable privately without anyone noticing. She has to let go. She has to reach out and let go. And what both of these stories illustrate for us, what all of these people experienced, is this young prophet doing extraordinary things in this little town by the lake, right? And where it ends is with a group of people being astonished that where someone had passed away, they no longer laid, right? And maybe you see the parallels there. That the story ends with a crowd of people astonished that someone who had been dead right there just before no longer is. And in verse 43, we find maybe the strangest part, at least without the miraculous side of this whole thing, that Jesus strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. He tells them not to tell anyone about how this little girl had been healed. Now, if you're like me, your natural instinct at least, maybe you can make the choice to overcome this, but your natural instinct is that if you do something like bring someone back to life, I want to be on a billboard, right? I want people to know about that. But Jesus tells people, no, don't tell anyone. And it's strange to us, but I think it's because something bigger was afoot, right? Remember how Mark begins this, that something about Jesus and his message was dangerous and subversive. Because if you're the king of Rome, if you are the king over this, the Roman king over this area of the world, and you hear about this man who's going around with the power to heal the dead, the power to heal the sick, and he's going around preaching about his kingdom, there's going to be some eyebrows raised at that, and they're not going to be favorable, right? So Jesus knows that there's something big that's happening in this little town on this day, bigger even than the miraculous healing of a little girl and the miraculous raising, miraculous raising of a girl and the miraculous healing of a woman, because Jesus was enacting a plan to confront evil and death at its very heart. You know the end of the story. You know that Jesus is on the way to confront death itself and to defeat it by being defeated by it, right? That's where this story ends. But this time, after he wins this battle, there's no command to be silent because his kingdom is breaking into this world. So we can say, in a way that they couldn't, that there's something big that's happening in our little town of Mableville right here and right now as well. Because the good news of the kingdom, the good news of God's reign here on earth, is able to be shouted from the rooftops that Jesus defeats death and fear and guilt and shame by taking all of them on and then breaking through them. By winning, he wins by losing. And it's this kingdom of repenting and healing and saving. It's a kingdom, in many ways, of faith. Don't fear, only believe. Now that word, that concept of faith and belief, it can feel abstract. It can feel like it's not a real-life concept. It's something we talk about in here, but out there, maybe it looks a little bit different. But I wonder, I've been thinking lately for myself, I really wonder if there are many things in life that are more real life than faith, that matter more in real life than reaching out to Christ and letting go of my control. Letting go of my need to control my schedule on a daily basis. Letting go of my need to control the people around me and what they think of me. Letting go even of my need to control my own salvation by crossing every I and crossing every T, as though Jesus doesn't do that for me. That I need control. Now, what we're talking about here, a life of faith, living by faith, is a deep transformation. It runs so deeply that Jesus compares it to being nailed to a beam and left to die, right? Like that's the image. He says, take up your cross and follow me. And he uses such an extreme image because it's such an extreme reorientation of our lives that we don't naturally reach out to someone else for help and let go. That's not what we do unless we realize that I can't do it for myself. Unless we realize that the point of holding on for dear life loses its luster if dear life is just a rotten shell of what life is supposed to be. Because that cliche of the hero hanging on just by a finger from the bridge and they can only be saved by their own determination and effort, that looks great in the movies, but in real life, Jesus calls us to something different. He calls us to let go, to reach out, to let go, to live by radical faith. Now, what that looks like, at least in part, is by letting go of my throne over my life, letting go of my control over who I am, what I do, and where I belong, and letting Jesus sit down on the throne of my heart and dictate where he would have me go, who he would have me to be, and who he would have me to be around. That's the invitation that Jesus offers to you and to me. It's open anytime, but tonight we're going to have a special time, as we do every time we gather together, to invite anyone who would like to dedicate their life to Jesus by baptism tonight to come forward as we stand and as we sing together.